So much of what we say about community is just assumed. It's almost as like talking about community is almost like talking about motherhood and apple pie. We all have a shared understanding of what this actually is, but I'm not so sure. And so I want to actually start talking about community and try to get some robustness around these terms of what we mean by community. Community is not just a nice thing to have. It's actually a critical part of the solutions we're looking for and the possibilities we're trying to create. And so it's absolutely important that each of us in this room become much more clear and intentional about what we mean by community, and particularly in the field of community economic development. If we are not clear and intentional about it, then what happens to our efforts is that they just default to some form of generic business development. And the resources and assets that we have worked so hard to shepherd into this whole sector end up being appropriated by people who are higher up on the food chain. And so it's actually, this is warrior work for us to be intentional and clear about just what we mean by community. Now, community economic development is actually part of a sector. It's a very interesting sector because we seldom refer to it directly. It's just a thing that's often assumed, a bit like our whole nature of community. It's almost like the sector is like some sort of natural resource existing in a back paddock somewhere it's all okay for us to go and raid it every now and then. And we don't, it's so peculiar that we don't even refer to this sector usually by its own name. We refer to it in a peculiar reversal. We refer to it by what it's not. We talk about the not-for-profit sector, okay? We talk about non-government organisations, and you know how stupid that is. If you just go to your next meeting and talk to every government person and refer to them as an NCO, a non-community organisation, then you really get a sense of what we're talking about. Or we refer to it as the third sector, which is just some sort of body signal we give to let everyone know we know our status in the food chain. Which a speaker here last year said, the third sector is like coming second at losing. So, there's something about our common conspiracy that we don't refer to it directly. We are the community sector. Our job is to dare to speak its name. And even more, our job is to turn up to the principles and be clear and intentional about what those principles are in the community sector. There are as many ways to define the community sector as there are people. Now, I personally have no problem with that. It's only a problem for people who are trying to organise or manage us. It's not really a problem for communities. And, Marilyn Waring once said at a meeting here in Auckland a few years ago, a local government meeting, she said, she advised us all to stop talking about the community and talk more about communities. And there's some real truth in that because we are a section of tremendous diversity. But there are lots of ways to describe the community sector, and there's actually lots of ways to describe the purpose of community. And you've had lots of workshops already, and people put up their PowerPoint. This is how I define something. This is my one. The purpose of community is to raise children, to foster friendship, to lead a satisfying life, and to look after one another and the earth. This is just the current one that I'm working with. Okay. Now, community development is everything we do to build the well-being and the capability to get on with that job. A short way of saying what community development is it's what people do to make things better. It's actually as simple as that. Now, community economic development is everything we do to foster the enterprise, to create livelihoods, and to organise our assets so that we can make a better job of this. You with me? Now, there's a whole list of basic things that drive this sector that have to be put in place before we get the chance to raise our kids and to live a satisfying life. And that's the next list. Now, it's a pretty obvious list. We all kind of know, we carry this list in our bones, right? It's about addressing poverty. It's about real job creation. It's affordable housing. It's getting a health system that promotes well-being and cares for the sick and the disabled. It's about getting an education system that grows skills and capabilities. It's about having a natural environment that can be sustained for future generations. That's the package of things that we call the community sector. All these groups, this huge, messy, chaotic diversity of groups, that exist in the community sector, you know, they're not trying to be organised, they're just trying to get on with making things better in the way that we are. Now, if we can just go back, no. Thank you. One back further. If that's not there, if that's not present, if these things are not present in our communities, we certainly notice it. Like, we've had lots of stories here. We had stories in this room yesterday from Lindsay Jepps about noticing it after a great, you know, a sudden shock like in Christchurch. And suddenly you realise this is the infrastructure that really makes things value. But also, if these things aren't here and we experience them in the slow shocks that take place in our communities, like actually a slow shock taking place right now. The last time this slow shock was taking place was in the 1990s. And we certainly were hurting in our communities as a result of that. And it's no mistake, or it's no coincidence that the first 5 points on this list were also the first 5 things that the Hikoi of Hope marched on in 1998, when we were certainly suffering in the community sector as a result of the slow but sudden and shocking economic and political change. 2 forward things. Okay. Now, last year I did a talk called As If People and the Earth Mattered, and some of you will actually know that most of that title actually comes from this man who is was the economist to the British Coal Board, and his name was Fritz Shoemaker, or E.F. Shoemaker. And 40 years ago he wrote quite an important book called Small is Beautiful, and that book was subtitled As If People Mattered. Economics as if people mattered. We now look back over that 40 years and see that Shoemaker was one of the most important thought leaders in the field of community economic development that we've had in the last 40 years. A lot of those key economic thinkers that have followed him, people like Hazel Henderson, people like Paul Hawken, have been, you know, the DNA of Shoemaker's thinking is so much in their work. Now, you may notice that I changed the title to not just As If People Mattered, but As If People and the Earth Mattered. And I think Shoemaker himself probably would have done that if he was living at these times. He was, after all, also the president of the British Soil Association. But the reason why so many of us have changed that title is because of the just pressing needs of this time. We've learnt something in the last 40 years. And what we know, we're the first generation to fully know that every natural system on Earth is declining, and it's declining at a rate which is accelerating. And we're the first generation to fully know the details of that and to have to come to grips with that in our time. All this matters. It matters. We all have to be green now. Every community organisation, every government department, every university campus, every corporation, every business, they actually have to be green whether they like it or not, because that is really the demands of our generation and our particular time. Now, one of the side effects of this situation of the fact that we have to really acknowledge the fact that the earth matters is that our language and our metaphors are starting to change. Instead of the old machine metaphors that many of us sort of grew up with, we're now those that came from physics. A lot of our metaphors on how we're describing our work are starting to change and come from biology, and they're talking about living systems. Now, I like that because communities themselves are more living systems. And community is a living system, and like every other living system, it's also in decline at the present time. But like also every other living system, there is hope there, because living systems are also self-organising, they can learn, they can adapt, and they can change. And that's really what community economic development is about. Another way of describing community economic development is to talk about what it's for, and we can again also look to biology in this. The biologists tell us that life exists to create the conditions for life. Get it? Evolution is its own virtuous cycle. The same is true of community economic development. Community economic development exists to create the conditions which make community more possible. It's got its own virtuous cycle going on too. And so creating the conditions for that virtuous cycle is the reason for community development. It's the reason for community economic development. It just keeps turning. And at the axle of this turning are two key insights. Number one is, whatever problem we're facing, whatever the problems may be, the answer is community. Okay? The second point is, whatever possibilities may be, it's going to take community. That's what keeps this thing turning. So if you wanted to know what my workshop was about, it was all in that section there. So if anyone needs to go anywhere else, now's the time. So can we move on? Thanks. Great. I want to talk a little bit about my work with social entrepreneurs and that I've been doing for the last 5 years. And about 5 years ago, philanthropy commissioned me to go ahead and I was told to go and find 15 of the top social entrepreneurs in the country, as if there was actually such a thing. So in the end, a committee decided who this group was, but once we found each other, we found it was a very interesting connection. And we've been meeting every 6 months in that particular time at the retreat centre in Long Bay, and talking to each other about our work, about what it takes to do that work. I'm pleased Malcolm Campbell's here in the room as part of this group. And we've really established that group as a learning community. Well, that group, the funding for that group actually ran out 2 years ago, but we looked around the room and we looked at each other and said, well, we haven't finished. And so we've just kept on going, and we've been sorting out how to pay for that ourselves. But it's just really important that we keep these connections happening and keeping the conversations happening about the deeper layers of our work. We're not really actually finding it anywhere else. Here's Brian Donnelly, who works with the Housing Foundation, really generating some fundamental changes in the way we approach affordable housing in the country. This is Emelina Awhiake from South Auckland. She's presently in Tonga running a coffee business, but she also set up a tremendous network of mentoring for young people in South Auckland. Gail Surgener brought the team together in MSD, which started the SKIP campaigns, and also went on to do the It's Not Okay family violence campaign. Here's Malcolm Cameron out the back here. He won't ever tell you directly, but he's one of the great social entrepreneurs of this country, and particularly working with young people and how to create projects that really bring out their potential. This is Kim Workman, who's been working in prisons for a huge period of time with the Prison Fellowship, and has been leading a whole project to do with rethinking crime and punishment in New Zealand. This is Nuku Rapana, who is the president of the Puka Puka community, which is a small atoll 4 days boat ride north of the Cook Islands. But actually most of them live here in Auckland. They're one of the poorest communities in Auckland, but they're also one of the best organised communities in terms of their own community development. Robin Allison is here at the conference, and she's one of the main drivers behind the Earth Song eco neighbourhood in Rānui. Viv Maderborn heads up CCS Disability Action. It's a huge group offering services and community development in the disability community. Philip Paxton is a key thinker in this country around the state of services and disability and diversity in the country. Campbell Roberts heads up the Salvation Army's services. He runs $100 million worth of social services. He was at the forefront of the response to Christchurch. He runs those services here and also in Tonga. John Stansfield is no stranger to anyone in this room. He's one of the great social entrepreneurs of Auckland, working on the anti-gambling issues, working on recycling issues in Waiheke, and now he's just landed on in a job in Oxfam, trying to do work for Oxfam. Naho and Debbie Davis work in Moerewa, in the small Northland town of Moerewa, where they have just been transforming that town with their economic development procedures and their programs for young people, and also community development approaches. Stephanie McIntyre, she works with some of the hardest people to reach in our communities, the chronic alcoholics on the streets of Wellington, and she's been trying to do her social innovations to try and get wet house accommodation for those chronic alcoholics, because she's basically saying we're not going to solve any of these problems of these people until we get a roof over their heads. So that's the group that we've been working with. You know, we've kept meeting, but we've started slowly opening up this group to a whole younger group of people, some of which are here at this conference. We just opened it up to the younger people in our own networks. And next slide, thank you. I'm also writing up some of the stories of the social entrepreneurs, and this will be published later this year. And it's going to be it's a series of profiles of the social entrepreneurs, because one of the things we realise is the stories behind these people are really not told much in the regular media in this country. Certainly not in the way that they would wish them to be told. So I've gotten alongside each of the social entrepreneurs and actually talking about what would it take to put your story on, you know, in 6 or 8 pages into some sort of format that can be spread. Because as we've started working with younger people, we've realised that younger people have actually got no idea what it takes to do this work. And most of them are, we were talking just outside, most of them are trapped in a sort of a Disney model of social change, as if things would change if it was just a good idea. And actually, there's a whole process of growing up that has to happen around taking on the issues that you need to have, that if you're really waking up and saying, I want to make a change in that particular area. And one of the things that we're doing, thank you, is we're going to be running an open masterclass later this year, actually led by Billy Matheson, who's here, and the Regeneration Crowd with Lani Evans. And we're doing that in September, and that's going to be open to anyone who actually wants to come along to that, so we can start to share some of these things. So that's a little bit on the work of the social entrepreneurs. Now, you know, I've noticed more and more in the community sector since the crash of 2008, quite a growing oppositional nature between the community sector and the business community. And I tell you, right, there's lots of good reasons why that should be. You know, there hasn't been one person arrested over in the States or in Europe for their part in the financial crash. And you know, and I think that we have to actually look at the dynamics underneath what's actually happening and the consequences that those have happened in our community. But what I've noticed more and more is a bit of a love-hate thing happening between community leaders and some of the stuff actually happening in the community. We don't see it so much in these forums when we're talking about business and enterprise, but it's certainly there. I've had many of my colleagues confront me and say, express their irritation about how things that have been long valued in the community suddenly only get valued outside of our sector if they're expressed in business terms. Things like, you know, talking about social capital, or talking about a social return on investment, or, for God's sake, talking about social entrepreneurs. And so by adding a sort of a business cachet of this, we can somehow get them valued outside our particular sector. But I just want to stand here and say, entrepreneurship is not a quality that belongs to business, any more than care is a quality that belongs to the community sector. We just have to get out of this oppositional thinking around the thing. Viv Maderborn, you know, is a great thinker in this regard. And I remember at one of our meetings, Viv said, you know, she just stood up and said, what are the possibilities that can emerge if we reject this polarity that is emerging in our sector? What are the possibilities that emerge when we reject that polarity? And when I start looking at the possibilities, I think, well, actually, our job at this present time is to become more clear and intentional about what we mean by community alongside the people who are talking about business strategies for social change. And it's important for us to stand up and speak those things, or else it just defaults to a mainstream business point of view. So I've got 5 points that I'm going to be talking about here, which I'm not saying there are only 5 points. These are just a way of capturing what I really want to share today. The first point is we're talking about entrepreneurship for the common good. And we have to be quite strident about that. Let's not apologise for the fact that we're in service to the common good. I've heard that as a phrase many times in this conference. It is not so regularly shared outside this sort of sector. The important thing here when you're talking about entrepreneurship for a common good, it has to be an alive conversation. You can't just build it into your infrastructure. It has to be an alive conversation that's at your trust boards. That you have to have trustees that are going to be speaking for the common good as much as they are speaking for prudent management, prudent directorship, and all that sort of stuff. They have to be people who speak for the common good there. You have to have people alive at the heart of your enterprise who are asking the questions, what is the public interest here? And what are the interests of the earth? Those are the questions we need at our trust board tables. Things change when we protect and count those interests. We've already found that, you know, in the business world with the Business Council for Sustainable Development and their work with the triple bottom line. Once they start counting them and they start valuing them, and it starts coming into it. But we need those people who are speaking for these values at these top tables. One of our social entrepreneurs, excuse me, Brian Donnelly, has a really interesting way of describing his projects in housing. And he instead of calling him, he's part of the not-for-profit sector, you've heard my kōrero on that one, he says we're the more than profit sector, okay? And he describes his projects as more than profit projects. And I think we need to actually be describing our stuff more in those particular terms. Or else, again, we will just be overrun by the default settings of the status quo. I believe that entrepreneurship is actually a creative key to many of the social changes that we want to pursue in our communities. It's actually going to be really important for us to foster entrepreneurship in our community sector. I'm totally on board with the outline of entrepreneurship principles that Steve Lawrence was giving in his session yesterday. Our sector needs to better understand these principles. It needs to actually harness this creativity in ways that we just are not really doing at the moment. And in fact, being a social entrepreneur for the last 40 odd years, I recognise that many times in my sector, the community sector that I've been in service to, people have thought, well, he doesn't even really belong in this sector because he's helping people create businesses. And we have to really get out of that level of oppositional thinking. What if I can get some more water? Thanks, Carl, that'd be great. Okay, next one. And that is the question of, we need to understand the difference between organising problems and healing them. I've mentioned this many times. If you ever come to one of my workshops, I harp on about this particular one. It's a key turning in our thinking that has to take place. One of the shady sides of social business is that there's a lot of money to be made from just organising our problems, thanks Carl, and our social or environmental problems. It's actually one of the shady sides of our business. We can just make a lot of money out of it and not fundamentally change things. In fact, it's a good business plan to have is not to change things, because then you've got a business next year on the whole situation. Well, that's not social entrepreneurship as far as I'm concerned. Unless you've got trustees around the table who are talking about the common good, those social businesses will always stay in that rut. Social entrepreneurship is essentially about disrupting the status quo. It's not about organising the problem, it's about healing the problem. That's why I call that book, How Do Communities Heal? The social entrepreneur wants to permanently alter the perceptions, behaviour and structures that are creating the problems in the first place. They actually want to do themselves out of business. It's not entirely the story, actually. And I'll talk a little bit about that coming on. But on the face of it, they really want to do themselves out of business. Understanding the difference between organising the problem and healing the problem. This is one of the charts in the coming out of the writing that I'm going to be publishing soon. Is one of the key creative tools of understanding how things move in the community sector. We're trying to take things essentially from this column where we're just organising the social and environmental problems around us and moving them towards this column over here. And there's a place in between which is actually our reflective work, where we get to question the problem. Now, there's a whole workshop on that, and I'm not giving it right now. But you know, these are some of the key ideas that belong in our sector as a result of it. My own case, you know, I spent 7 years working for the Salvation Army, organising unemployed people. I just realised we weren't really solving any problem there. It was only at that point that I decided that I would start the Skills of Enterprise training programs, which were about how to help these people start their own businesses. And many of those people, those businesses and those people are still thriving in Taranaki today. It's a situation repeated everywhere where we're trying to do essentially developmental work. My mates in Moirua, Naho and Debbie, they came to the same things. Naho has this whole kōrero where he's talking about you know, running training schemes. And basically he says, I think we were just turning people into training junkies. Because for God's sake, there were no jobs for them to go to in the Moirua area. And we had to have trustees around the table who were telling the truth around that. And not just saying, where's our next contract coming from? It's important to be robust about these principles. Now, making the whole change from that place to a community development approach in our organisations, actually it takes a whole change. You lose half your trustees. You lose half the people you lose half your funding. Because one of our other characteristics of our sector, most of our funders are only interested in the problems and not the possibilities. And we have to actually start to try and challenge that, that dynamic at the same time. Next one, thanks. One of the key principles is, oh, no, I was on the wrong page. The economics in the community sector is completely different. This is something that, you know, the kaumātua of the community development field is a man called John McKnight, who worked for years out of Chicago. And, you know, John's having a late age renaissance at the moment, and he's just doing some tremendous work. He's just published a book called The Abundant Community, and in that book, with Peter Block, in that book, he is just explaining that, you know, economics is often described as the dismal science, because if you ask an academic to define what economics is, they will tell you that it is the study of scarce resources and the allocation of scarce resources. This concept of scarcity is woven into the way that we centrally think about economics. And it's done that way because market value is tied to a sense of scarcity. Now, community economics actually turns that on its head. And that's why I said, if we in the community just focused on our problems, we never get to the possibilities. If we just focus on our scarcity, we never actually get to the place where we can unleash what is most abundant in us. And that is our gifts and our abundancies in our own communities. And somehow we have to turn that on its head at the same time in the way that we operate. And we have to speak for these things. Now, I know all about the dismal science because you know, I've been trying to work on the unemployment issue for most of my adult life. And if you actually, you know, if you look at biology, you can actually see we are the only species on the planet that does not have full employment. It sounds ridiculous, but it's actually true. And we have organised our economic system so that that is the actual case of it. I was astounded about this. I'd never been told this until I went down to the labour market unit down in the Department of Labour in Wellington, and they showed me their formulas. And I said, what's this thing called NAIDU? You're multiplying it by the NAIDU, N-A-I-R-U. And they said, oh, that's a non-inflation adjusting rate of unemployment. So it's actually built into their economic models. And somehow we have to have the political will to challenge that assumption that these things should be built into the very way we frame up our economy. Now, as John McKnight has said, and we had a speaker here last year from, you know, John McKnight started the ABCD community development movement, and we had a speaker here last year about that ABCD is about focusing on the gifts and assets. It's about that switch that happens in our communities, and a switch in attitudes about the economic significance of these assets to our communities. That's the starting point for community economic development. And sometimes those gifts and assets are right in front of us and we're just not looking at them. Now, Lindsay Jess was here yesterday talking about Whale Watch and the tremendous revival in Kaikoura that Whale Watch has actually produced. Well, I was at one of those first meetings at Kaikoura Marae when they were talking about what can we do for economic development in this area. And it was a rather odd Quaker guy who was not Maori, stood up and he said, well, do you Maoris realise that there are whales out there? And they were looking around saying, well, yes. And you know, and then the conversation actually started. So sometimes these things are just obviously around us and we haven't necessarily taken advantage of them. Next one, thanks. The fourth thing is that in the community sector, we don't just talk about producers and consumers, we talk about producers, consumers and sharers. Again, in a market system based on scarcity, it tries to just constrain everything into these two things. You're either a producer and a consumer, or a consumer. That process is actually interrupted in our communities by the way we share with one another. This is a particularly important point to take into account when we have an economy at the moment that is based on information rather than an economy based on industry, as it has been for most of my adult life. But now we've moved fully into a time where the economy is based on information. And the thing about information is that I've got some information and I give it to you, I'm no less. Am I? Whereas if I had a pound of wheat and I gave it to you, I might have to do without that wheat. So an economics based on information is right going towards this area here. We certainly see this in the interruption of market models that we're seeing at the moment around file sharing on the internet. Now, anyone who file shares here, I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up to an illegal activity, but what is considered legal, I actually consider the file sharing environment one of the great achievements of humanity. It's actually, if you look at what is in the file sharing environment, it cannot be matched by consumer capitalism. You cannot match the ability of hundreds of thousands of people just sharing for each other and curating that resource for each other. And I think it should be something that's celebrated rather than treated as criminal. The fact is the model is changing and we have to go with and revision what our model is as a result of it. And certainly young musicians are seeing file sharing as an asset to the creation of their business rather than something that's actually wrong. You see the same principle of sharing right throughout the community sector. Now, take you, Malcolm. When I came down and I wanted to have a look at Malcolm's projects, he showed me around all the things that the Malcolm Trust is actually doing, and that's exceptional enough. He said, oh, well, I'll show you these other things also, Vivian. And these are all the other groups that he's helping get going. So Malcolm's not there saying, well, this is all about my business. He might have named the trust after himself, but he knows it's not about Malcolm, it's not about Malcolm Cameron, He's gone ahead, he started, he worked to create the Bargain Barn alongside Habitat for Humanity. He got Supergreen started, he did the Prince of Wales Trust, he did all sorts of stuff. And he's creating this place which is just incubating a whole lot of other whole new things. And that's about us sharing our resources so that we become more capable at doing this and creating the virtuous circle that we really want to see in our communities. We're seeing that in our field. And we're seeing it in the enterprise field. There is the rise at the moment of a tremendous network of collaborative entrepreneurship. This is happening with the work that Ashoka is doing and running competitions called collaborative competitions on major social issues. The website IDEO has also started doing a whole software infrastructure to facilitate collaboration between different social entrepreneurs on different subjects. How am I doing? Next one, thanks. The last one I want to talk about is awakening citizenship. This is actually the primary role of a social entrepreneur. This is actually what our businesses are in service to. This is actually our main sustainability strategy, is how we awaken people alongside this journey. Our job is not to provide services and turn everyone into consumers. It's to awaken the systemic change which might include new services, might include entirely new projects, but basically we're trying to awaken the capacity of people to do these things for themselves. Now, the guy who coined the term social entrepreneurship, Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, just a few years ago gave an important speech at Oxford where he said the role of a social entrepreneur is They have no interest in capturing a market and then digging a moat around it. That's the usual business model: capture a market, dig a moat around it. Social entrepreneurs want to change the world. They want to recruit other people to become change makers. That's the reason why we've used that term, change makers, because the role of a social entrepreneur is actually to create more change makers in their community. We know we're not going to face up to the biggest challenges that we've got in our communities until we can completely change our sense and depth of citizenship. And at the moment, most of our understanding of citizenship has been, just so totally captured by a consumer worldview. Even our political system has been so captured by consumerism and marketing that we tend to think of voting as some sort of shopping that we do every 3 years. And that's the limit of our citizenship. We need to awaken citizenship from a completely different place, and that's our sustainability strategy for how we address most of the issues that we're trying to address. We awaken the citizenship at a place which gets people to answer the question, what is my contribution to the common good? When we step up to the answer of that question, we step up to becoming the change makers that our communities need right now. So those are my 5 points. Now I just want to give you some illustrations of some of these things coming from Taranaki. Next one, thanks. Okay, now Amakura Panaho last year gave a keynote speech of some of the work coming from Taranaki, and this is a trust board that I'm a member of, and a trust meeting. And this is Elaine Gill, who she spoke of during her speech last year. And last year, Elaine was one of the finalists in the 2010 Businesswoman's Award. I wanted to tell you a little bit about Elaine because she's a remarkable asset in our community. She's been the chair of the TSB Bank Board for the last 12 years, and thank God she was there. Because the TSB was one of the few banks that didn't sell themselves to Australia. It was the only New Zealand one left for a while until Jim Anderson got Kiwi Bank going again. And so it was a classic example of we needed trustees around that table who said, what's the common good here and what are the interests that we actually need? But she's also been a councillor for, New Plymouth District Council councillor for 9 years. She started over 20 community organisations, including the Taranaki Employment Support Foundation, the Taranaki Community Law Trust, Taranaki Barnados. She has started the Better Homes Trust that does retrofitting of houses. She started the Taranaki Kiwi Trust and also the Taranaki Community Health Trust. Get it? When does she have time to sleep? The thing I want to talk about is for the last 10 years, Elaine has also been chairperson of the Taranaki Arts Festival Trust, and she led the bid to get WOMAD to Taranaki. Okay. Now WOMAD, I've been to every WOMAD, and I used to come and I used to stay at your place, and we'd go to Western Springs and see WOMAD. But of course, Auckland, the economy of how that was framed here in Auckland, I believed it wasn't going to pay here. But thank God, 5 years later, we shifted it to New Plymouth, and it found its home there, and we've found a way to make it pay. And one of the major reasons we've found a way is because it is a community, it's treated as a community enterprise. Can we just go to the next one, thanks? How many people here have been to WOMAD? How many would like to go to WOMAD? Yeah, that's great. Well, if you look at WOMAD and they put up all their sponsors, you've got one of the big sponsors is the council itself. You've got the TSB Bank as a major sponsor. You've got the TSB Community Trust. So actually, basically what all those three things are saying to us is WOMAD is sponsored by the people of Taranaki. There's also Shell and Todd Energy, but also there's 1,000 volunteers. There's only 15,000 people there that we can fit on the site, but 1,000 of them are actually volunteers doing all sorts of jobs to make it happen. This is the community capital that makes this particular enterprise the success it actually has. The other community capital we have is a long asset that is loved by the people of New Plymouth, and that's the Bowl of Brooklands, which is just a tremendous venue to run something like this particular festival. Now you look at the figures here. WOMAD runs on a budget of $3.5 million. We're told that it has an economic impact in the Taranaki area of $9.32 million. It's no small biggies. And it's done on the back of our ability to look at our assets, which in Taranaki are hospitality, and place things like the Bowl of Brooklands, and on the top of those assets, we can build the enterprises that we can also have a great deal of fun at the same time. Okay, I want to just talk about another thing happening as an example here, and over the next few months we're not going to hear about anything else except the Rugby World Cup, and we won't get a word in the edgeways, and it's particularly true in Taranaki. We have 5,000 registered rugby players in Taranaki. They tell us there are 60,000, out of a province of 100,000 people, there are 60,000 people directly connected to rugby in the province. As I was being driven in here, picked up for the airport, someone from Community Waitakere said she'd come here from Dublin, and the religious conflicts there are in Ireland, and she was told when she came to New Zealand, you can be any religion you like as long as the religion is rugby. And that's absolutely true of Taranaki, and I have to put my hand up and say I seem to have missed this particular piece of DNA. I'm a great disappointment to my brothers, because when the rugby comes on, I'm usually out of the room. I just got to find something better else to do. But I tell you, my ears do prick up when I see how the rugby people organise themselves and the community enterprises that exist around this ecosystem of the sport in Taranaki. Now, my former secretary, her father and family are all based out in Tikarangi, and that's where the Russians came at the beginning of this year to start practicing for the World Cup. They came to experience the hospitality of Taranaki and play rugby at Tikarangi at the Clifton Rugby Club. Now, and while they're at that rugby club, the club rooms, the gymnasium, the grandstand, they'd all been built on the back of a social enterprise run by that rugby club. It was contract haymaking. Each year, the Pākehā, largely farmers, donated the equipment, and the rugby players, usually Maori people from Waitara, went out and got the hay in. And as a result of that, the assets went to build these rugby assets. Now, back one. Now, I know there's a lot of criticism in sporting circles around the culture change that's taken place around rugby and the professionalisation of rugby and the marketing of rugby and all that sort of thing. And there's a whole debate that actually has to happen. In Taranaki, they just say, stop whinging and step up to doing things differently. And what they actually have done to confront the loss of income to the community rugby clubs in the current climate is that they've bought themselves a farm. And they are running it. And they're running it as a social enterprise to support the community rugby clubs. They lease a 170 hectare farm in Manaia. The farmers are donating cows. They've even, this is just last week, what's his name? Henry. Has turned up, and he bought a cow, and of course it had to be all black. And it's just, that's how they're getting the money that they need into their community rugby side of things. Their goal is that they want to be debt-free and distribute $100,000 a year to 17 community rugby clubs in the Taranaki area. Now that's classic asset-based community economic development. And one of the points I'm wanting to make here is that many of us that are running social services can actually learn a great deal from music and the arts and sport about how to step up to some of the more enterprising sides of the things that we may be challenged to do. I wanted to actually, Mayor Len Brown spoke the other night about his goal was to make Auckland the most livable city in the world. Remember that? And what he didn't realise is that New Plymouth has already been judged. In 2008, we were judged the most livable city in the world by a United Nations panel. And it's really interesting about New Plymouth. We're a rich city. We are a rich city. We've got investments everywhere. And you may be surprised to find out that New Plymouth people own a sizable chunk of Tasmania. And how that happens is that when we sold our electricity company some years ago, unlike the other groups that just did a big distribution of the assets from the electricity company, a choice was taken. We had the right people in the trust boards, right? A choice was taken that there would be an intergenerational dividend from that money. And so they put that money into an investment in perpetuity. So Timil, the Taranaki Investment Management Limited, was set up. It's got a $260 million portfolio. It subsidises our rates. It actually puts in $21.5 million a year to bring the rates bill down. In the time that they've been operating, they have actually paid out $115 million. This is about community economic development and how we get our assets to work in our direction. And I have to say, one of the directors of that company is the same Elaine Gill that was on that photo. Now, half of its investments are in Tasman farms. 20,000 hectares, 23 dairy farms, and a huge beef and sheep station on the northwest corner of Tasmania. And most New Plymouth people just don't know that they own a sizable chunk of Tasmania. So, but you know, the point I'm not making is just, I'm not trying to show off New Plymouth here. I'm actually trying to point out a principle that is at work here. And it's the same principle that we learned from the rugby crowd. You know, 2 weekends ago, I went to a fundraising family street market in the main street of New Plymouth. It was fundraising for our Waves Youth Centre. And, you know, they're always fundraising for this youth centre. You know, I've got to the stage where I'm embarrassed about the fact that this youth centre, which is doing fantastic work, has to constantly be fundraising to keep itself going, and we all stand around and think that it's you know, just a law of nature that they have to do this. They're providing an excellent youth one-stop shop of health and support services. And I see the main social entrepreneur behind that, Lou Roebuck, lining up in front of committees and government departments and politicians to plead the case for funding for that all the time. Now, this is an appalling rigmarole that we force all our social services to go through on a sometimes 6-monthly basis. And the question I'm asking here is, how many times do we have to decide that one of the primary goals of our community should not just be that it should be a livable place, but a great place to raise children and a great place for young people to find themselves? How many times do we have to make that decision? At the moment, we've got a political and grant-making system that forces us all, and some of our best people, to keep making that decision every 6 months. Now, what I'm saying is we can learn from other strategies on how to push some of our assets so that we can say we've made that decision, there's the asset, and go for it. I think we have to get groups like Waves off the charity treadmill. We should buy them a farm. Perhaps we should give them one in Tasmania, and dedicate the earnings of that work for the well-being of our young people, because that's how a community steps up to its economy. Next one. You still with me? Christchurch is also a rich city. It's got investments everywhere. Now, I know that we're not talking about this as much in the view of what they're having to face, but they have saved well for a rainy day, and they've just had their wettest moment. And I'm not just talking about the liquefaction coming up, or the grief and tears that comes from the obvious loss that is around us. But this is a time when we should be spending those resources that we actually put aside. And it's going to take dozens of people like Lindsay Jeffs to be speaking for the common good in those resources that have been put aside, and so make sure that they are not appropriated or taken away by interests that are higher up on the food chain. I wanted to talk about a whole lot of stuff to do with Christchurch, but I just want to, I wanted to talk about the student army. And Louis Brown was here yesterday, and he's one of the organisers, and many of you saw him on TV speaking about the activities of the student army during the crisis. And people were just saying how wonderful it was that the students actually come out and did that sort of thing. And we all felt that, didn't we? How great it was to actually see those pictures of the students helping with the clean up the streets. But actually, this is what we need when it's not a crisis also. Not the students coming out, but all of us to actually come out and reach out to each other. And Gary Moore, the former mayor, was on the radio last week, and he was talking about the needs of Christchurch. He said the greatest need at the moment is the sort of pastoral care that keeps us all in touch with one another. And I think that's, when I talked about us all being green at the moment, everybody working in Christchurch at the moment is a community development worker. Whether they are past or present mayors, whether they're working on the council, or whether they're working on business development schemes or whatever, they are community development workers. The only way we're going to make the restoration of Christchurch sustainable is by stepping up to our active citizenships in ways that help the citizens of Christchurch really reach out to one another. One of the things I want to actually say, I like the term regeneration, because most of the previous labels that spoke about a younger generation, they were designed by marketers or the consumer industry, you know, the X generation, the Y generation, baby boomers. They were all labels that were created to try and get us to understand how to sell to those particular groups. And this label called regeneration I like because it's actually speaking of something a lot deeper. It's speaking about, not about consumption, it's speaking about creativity. The young people that you see in this gathering that they have at their annual gathering, they're very motivated about good ideas and about giving it a go. They know the challenges ahead are not going to be dull. And I'm ashamed to say, as someone of an older generation, that we've left a lot of work for them to do. And it's actually the work of renewal and of repair and of restoration. Now, I think one of the really interesting things here is that Shoemaker spoke to this at the same time. He said something very interesting. He said there are some problems that, he said there are some problems that if you solve now, they're basically solved for quite some time. It's like infrastructure. You know, you put a bridge in place, it's basically there for quite some time. He's saying, but he also said there are some other problems that actually each generation has to grow up enough to be able to solve for itself. And we're really living at that time where the regeneration really, I believe, is the next generation growing up enough so we can really take on the huge challenges that are really in front of us at the moment. That regeneration is about awakening citizenship. It's about that level of citizenship that knows that we are the creators of the communities we want to live in. It knows that we are the stewards of the things that need to be cared for. And we're also producers of the possibilities that all of our children are going to be inheriting. And we need to step up to that particular job. It's quite simple, really. If we're alive and we're on the planet today, then it's our turn. It's really quite simple. It's our turn to speak the name of community. It's our turn to awaken our own citizenship, and it's our turn to redesign and develop our economies so that people and the earth really do matter.